Hi class. All right, now we're looking at chapter 16, Socio-Emotional Development in Middle Adulthood. This is Erikson's 7th stage of development, generativity versus stagnation. And what he means by this, is, as far as generativity is concerned, is leaving a legacy. So it could be children, it could be something you've done for your career or your occupation, for your culture. Those would be examples of generativity. And if you don't leave anything, if you're not successful in this stage of leaving something for you, you'll have a sense of stagnation. Now, there are other theories associated with this stage of development, or this age period. One is Levinson's Seasons of a Man's Life. What he did is he did research on primarily males, so it's a male perspective. It was very successful in the 1970s when he wrote this book. And so what he did is he broke down the development of males. First we've got teens, and that's their search for independence. Then we've got 20s, and that's kind of a novice phase where they're exploring different possibilities. I'm going to be this or that type of thing. Then from 28 to 33 is what he calls the boom stage, and that's being one's own man. So that's when they kind of venture out and are more stable in their career. And then 40 to 45, he talks about 4 conflicts occurring. Young versus being old, just as you're aging, the experiences you have. Destructive versus constructive. Masculine versus being feminine. And attached versus being separated. Now what's interesting is that with his approach came the famous midlife crises that he would say that males go through. Now what's interesting is that later research shows that males don't necessarily go through a midlife crisis. Maybe a third of them do, but most kind of navigate through midlife just like everybody else. What's interesting, though, is just as a side note, is that females are described as having a midlife consciousness. Males get the crises, females get the consciousness. Don't know why that is, but that's just the literature that they put out there for it. So that's one approach. Now, there are different approaches to this stage. One is a historical context. That's Newgarden's social clock. And that would say that we're expected to do certain things at certain times. For example, I had a client that was so interesting. This was years ago, who lived in a rural part of Arizona, southern Arizona, and he had never, ever married, never dated. In fact, he worked, was really productive, worked for 30, 40 years, for the same company, retired. He built his house in front of his parents' house. And of course, his house was bigger than his parents' house. But he lived with his parents the whole time. He said it wasn't that he was being isolated from others. He said, I just never met a female that I fell in love with. But he was very content, very well adjusted. But most people would look at that and say, wow, he's in his 60s. He was 65, I think, when I saw him, and basically never moved out. But he was well adjusted. But that's what I mean by the social clock. There are things that we expect to be accomplished at a certain time. Retirement, marriage, those type of things. Stability or change. Remember Costa and McCrae? They've got this 5-factor model on personality, and it says that personality is made up of 5 factors. 1, openness, or not open to experience. Conscientious, that's when you apologize if you're late, those type of things, or not conscientious. You can remember from the acronym OCEAN. Extroverted or introverted, outgoing or shy. Agreeableness, just agreeable, going along, or disagreeable, not going along. The last one is neuroticism, which is basically anxiety or not anxious. And so they would say that those are components that make up who we are, and that we will see them, they're fixed, we will see them throughout development, of adult development. And so they say they're very much, from a biological perspective. Now there's a bunch of different studies here, and I'm going to have to glance down on my book, guys, just because I've got some notes there, some specific notes about who they worked with. But let me just address them real quickly. There's 3 major studies. There's the Berkeley Longitudinal Study. They looked at more than 500 children and their parents, initially studied in the 1920s, early 1930s. Profiles of these individuals as they became middle-aged. And what they found is that the most stable characteristic, remember we talked about McRae and Costa, right? Was the degree to which individuals were intellectually oriented, self-confident, and open to new experiences. So again, we're looking at how stability and change and how things occur from childhood, or infancy, childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, and now we're at middle adulthood. Then there was a Helson's Mills College study, and this is probably the most famous because it really focused on women. That was the first major study that looked at how do women change, or is there a change with it? And what they did is they looked at, let me just glance down here real quick here. They initially studied 132 women who were seniors at Mills College in California in the late 1950s, then studied them again when they were in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Helson and her colleagues distinguished each of these groups of people into 3 major groups: family-oriented, career-oriented, or neither. They were neither family or career-oriented. And so what they found is that they did not go through this crisis, but went through their midlife consciousness. So they're the ones who coined that phrase. Then we've got George Vaillant's study, and it's kind of an interesting study. It looked at a sample of 268 socially advantaged Harvard graduates born in 1920, also called the Grant Study. A sample of 456 socially disadvantaged inner-city men born about 1930, and a sample of 90 middle socioeconomic status intellectually gifted women born about 1910. And what he found was so interesting. As they matured, as they grew older, what he found is that you could determine which category people would fall in during their 80s, 75 to 80-year-olds. And so they had categories of happy, well, sad, sick, and dead. When they were 50 years of age, to predict which categories they would likely end up in, that was the goal. And so what they found is that alcohol abuse and smoking at age 50 were the best predictors of who's going to be dead at 75 to 80. Factors at age 50 that were linked with being in the happy, well category at 75 to 80 included getting regular exercise, avoided being overweight, being well educated, having a stable marriage, being future oriented, being thankful and forgiving, empathizing with others, being active with other people, and having good coping skills. What I find interesting is that usually I'll ask the class, how important is money when you grow older? And what they found is that, in fact, money had very little to play as far as how they felt being happy well. However, poverty has a negative effect on that. So you don't necessarily have to be wealthy, but just having enough to take care of your needs, those are individuals that fell in that happy well category. And one other thing about personality is that conclusion they found through the studies is that it's more stable midlife than when they're younger. And that kind of makes sense if you think about Erikson's stages of development as well. Close relationships, love and marriage, 2 major forms of love, romantic and affectionate. We kind of talked about that with Sternberg's triarchy theory. 72% of people at this age said they were happy in their marriage, and usually that's because they've survived all the ups and downs that can be associated with the marriage. And by this age, they've gotten used to each other, so it's just worked out really well. Divorce, if it does occur, is more positive at this age than later, than an earlier age. And that's just because they've got more life experiences, and financially they're more stable set. They also talk about the empty nest and refilling it. And, I've met a lot of people that feel this empty nest, but most of them, and they don't necessarily fall in this category. What they will say in the text is that this empty nest syndrome is for individuals that live vicariously through their children. That means they want to see their child to do the things that they wanted to do as a child. And so those are individuals that have this empty nest experience. That's not always the case, but statistically speaking. Sibling relationships are more likely to improve. So if you had an adversarial relationships with your siblings when you're younger, in middle or middle adulthood, it's bound to get better. Statistically bound to get better. And then they look at grandparenting, 3 major types. Formal, where there's a proper and prescribed role with the grandchildren. Then there's fun seeking, there's informal and playful, and these are usually younger grandparents. And then there's the distant one, and this is a benevolent one, where, kiss my ring, that type thing. One thing that we do see that's more challenging is for grandparents with our high rate of divorce is suing or going to court to ensure that they have visitation rights with their grandchildren. So that's kind of a new change thing. Other one is that grandparents are many times, unfortunately, raising grandchildren. In fact, I had one client who she was in her 80s, great grandparent who was raising her great grandson who was 4 years old. And so she's very interesting woman. And then they talk about the sandwich generation, and that is where there's 3 generations living in the home at one time. And so with that said, guys, that is an introduction into chapter 16 and some of the highlights that I emphasize in class. Thank you, guys.